Again, almost all tissues are innervated by both systems of the ANS, okay? But the response that we have is a sum of both the excitatory and inhibitory influences. Oh my God, what does that mean, okay? It means that one may overtake the other, okay? They can either balance each other out, you can be somewhere in the middle, just kind of walking around, or we can be in flight mode, or we can be in veg mode, all right? So what happens, the effect that is on your body is a combination of the two of them, okay? So we always get into this, it's one or the other, but whichever one kind of overtakes the other, all right? And remember that the sensory fibers of one can influence the motor fibers of the other, okay? For instance, you're standing there and you go to lean, and you're very quiet, and your hand's on a hot stove, whoa, okay? So one can affect the other. You can go from one to the other very, very quickly. Okay, so parasympathetic, I told you we talk about this in detail, rest and digest, all right? Resting and digesting means that you're just kind of sitting there calmly, okay? Your pupils constrict, meiosis. Meiosis is a constriction of the pupils. Increased salivation, increased tears. Your lungs, you're not like out there running or whatever, your lungs constrict, okay? Profuse, watery saliva. Your digestion's working because you're just sitting there resting and digesting, okay? And because that's working, you may need to urinate or defecate more frequently, okay? And then there's that one in there, okay? We don't know quite where that fits in, but that is the one that helps that, so just so that you know. Okay, so I want to introduce you to, okay, Pansy the Meek, okay? And I have to give credit where credit is due here. This is from, I took a really, really good pharmacology class from West Virginia University with Dr. Karen Woodfork, who's wonderful. And I actually think this is her. I believe she used herself in this. And I can't think of any better way to illustrate this. I made up the name Pansy, okay? But Pansy the Meek, okay, likes to sit in bed, okay? And so she's reading a book, so her eyes are constricted and focused on the page. They're very small. She's reading a really sad book, okay? So her eyes are watering, she's crying, okay, the tale of woe. She's drinking, she's eating all brand. We all know what that stuff does, okay? So her heart rate's down, her lungs are constricted, and she's just sitting there very calmly reading and very shallow breaths in and out, okay? She may need to get up to go to the bathroom, it looks like, with all the drinking and the eating that she's doing there, okay? But there's Pansy the Meek, resting and digesting in bed. As opposed to the fight or flight of the sympathetic nervous system, okay? Dilation of the pupils, okay? I'm in fight or flight mode. My heart's beating fast. My lungs are dilated. Breathing in, breathing out. Okay, big breaths in and out. Okay, I need energy because I'm running away from whatever. My blood glucose, we do glycogenolysis. We've got all the blood glucose, dumping into the blood vessels so I could use it up. I'm sweating. Okay, not time to go to the bathroom. Okay, here, and my uterus contracts. Okay, or we have the other effect there as opposed to the other one. Okay, it's not erecting; it's doing the other thing. Okay. But that is the effect that the sympathetic has. So let me introduce you to Sandy the Brave. Okay, Sandy the Brave. And there's Dr. Woodfork. God bless her. I've got to write to her again. Okay, and she's walking in the woods. Okay, and she's got things going, and she sees a bear. Okay, oh my God, she sees the bear. All right, so her pupils are really, really big. Her heart rate is going right. Okay, she's breathing very hard. She's perspiring. Okay, again, not time to run to the bathroom, so she's not, there's no digestion going on there, that we need all of our energy to go into our muscles and whatnot and run away. Blood sugar in there to kind of fuel our muscles to go, okay? And she's in that definite fight or flight mode, okay? So you'll never forget about Pansy and Sandy, okay? That will really help you to remember this. And honestly, a pen and paper approach to this of writing down what the PANS does and what the SANS does would be really, really helpful to you. And I want to see it on all your exams, okay? I want you to write PANS and I want you to write SANS and I want you to list the effects that both of them have. And then when you go to answer a question, you're going to be able to do it because you're going to remember both sides of the system. And when we talk about drugs, both this week and in future weeks, having a parasympathetic effect or sympathopathomimetic effect, you'll know what they do. Okay, really, really important. So let's go back to our picture here that we looked at before, parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. And again, a lot of the same organs and tissues are innervated by them, but almost in opposite directions. Okay, so that will really help you to remember that. Okay, so let's talk about now the neurotransmitters, because in understanding how the body normally works, we can talk about what the drugs do to the body that will either work like the body or block what the body does if that's what we're trying to do. All right? So we call the neurotransmitters the carrier pigeons, okay? They carry the messages through our body in order to carry out our bodily processes, okay? Remember, let's go back to our neuron and our synapse, right? This was, I don't know if any of you looked at the basic information that I put in there about the nervous system when you're remembering the drugs, and that particular document is thanks to Dr. Karen Wordberg again, because it was very, very simplified, but just enough to be able to understand the drugs, okay? So there we've got our neuron again, our cell body, our axon, okay, our preganglionic fiber, we've got the synaptic terminal there, presynaptic neuron, the synaptic cleft, postsynaptic neuron. If this is all starting to sound like I know, good, because then you're there, all right? And remember that at that terminal is kind of where the magic happens. We've got those vesicles opening. We're going to look at that again, and then we're going to have that response depending on what messages are sent there, okay? So the chemical neurotransmitters send those messages between the preganglionic, postganglionic, and then the postganglionic and the effector organ or tissue, okay? Remember, the neurotransmitters can be released by ways of those little vesicles that work their way out to the synaptic cleft. They open up and release their contents. They bind to receptors. They might help drugs bind to the receptors. They might help other chemicals bind to those receptors, okay? And then they're going to have their response. And we've got a couple more videos for you here. They're a little bit repetitive, but I find them really, really helpful. Tell me that you're going to actually work here. Why is it one week they work and another week they don't? Oh, maybe it will. Okay. Here we go. So we've got two in a row here. This one's a little more simple, but it's a little additional information from what we had from last week, okay? So you can hear this.
Action potentials arriving at the presynaptic terminal cause voltage-gated calcium ion channels to open. Calcium ions diffuse into the cell and cause synaptic vesicles to release acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter molecule. Acetylcholine molecules diffuse from the presynaptic terminal across the synaptic cleft and bind to their receptor sites on the ligand-gated sodium ion channels. This causes the ligand-gated sodium ion channels to open and sodium ions diffuse into the cell, making the membrane potential more positive. If the membrane potential reaches threshold level, an action potential will be produced.
Okay, so added a little more in there about the calcium ions and whatnot, because we'll be covering that as well. Find that very, very helpful. Okay, and this goes into a little bit more detail with nerve action potential.
A chemical synapse is a special junction between two neurons that allows them to communicate without being physically connected. A synapse has several structures. The presynaptic neuron ends in a small bulb called the presynaptic terminal. The postsynaptic terminal membrane is directly adjacent, separated by a small space called the synaptic cleft. An action potential causes voltage-gated calcium ion channels to open in the presynaptic terminal. The influx of calcium ions prompts synaptic vesicles to release neurotransmitters via exocytosis. This neuron is releasing acetylcholine. The neurotransmitter quickly diffuses across the synaptic cleft. Two acetylcholine molecules bind with one ligand-gated sodium channel at the postsynaptic membrane, opening the channel. When enough sodium ion channels open, the postsynaptic cell depolarizes and the action potential continues along the neuron.
Okay, so a nice mental picture of how that process happens. talk about drugs affecting it, you'll be able to picture that. So the receptors are found on the postsynaptic neuron, okay, and on the fiber, and they can also be found on the effector organ. So that was between neurons, and then it happens between that last neuron and the effector organ or tissue. Now, depending on the neurotransmitter and or the drug, okay, the specific neurotransmitter, okay, and the receptors will dictate what the response will be. So there are different neurotransmitters and there are different receptors, okay? Between the preganglionic and postganglionic neurons, okay, of the pans and the sans, okay, both of them, acetylcholine, like they just talked about, is the neurotransmitter. Pans and sans, between pre and post, is ACH, acetylcholine, both, okay? And they release acetylcholine, and the nerves that release them are then called cholinergic. Acetylcholine, cholinergic. The synapse is then stimulated by can be stimulated by nicotine, okay, so they call it nicotinic. Why do they use that word? It is so responsive to nicotine that they actually called it nicotinic, okay? So the synapse is then stimulated, and that's called a nicotinic response. So it's cholinergic and nicotinic. Just take my word for it. Okay. So between the postganglionic neuron and then the effector organ, this is where we get our difference, okay? Between pre and post, pans and sans, acetylcholine. Pans and sans now differ between the postganglionic and the effector tissue or organ, okay? In the pans, it is again acetylcholine. ACH, ACH. So it's called acetylcholine, so it's called cholinergic. And at this point, it's also called muscarinic. And I'll tell you why we need to know this stuff, okay? So pans, acetylcholine at the postganglionic to the effector tissue, cholinergic, muscarinic. In the sans, it is not acetylcholine, but norepinephrine, which is released from the postganglionic fiber of the neuron into the effector tissue, okay? This is now called adrenergic because adrenaline is the same thing as?
Epinephrine.
Yay! Okay, you remember that, adrenaline, okay? And if not to make things even more complicated, okay, there are different responses that they can have depending on what receptor is affected, okay? There's alpha adrenergic receptors and beta adrenergic receptors. And we know that this is very, very important because depending on the tissue which is affected, so if it's your blood vessels or your heart or your lungs, okay, different receptors are going to be more or less responsive to these chemicals that are released. And when we learn about the drugs can be made specifically for certain receptors or not. And whether they affect the alpha or the beta is going to affect how they affect your body, okay? So the specificity counts. So just to show that again in a schematic point of view, in the autonomic nervous system, okay, we can see we have the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. Parasympathetic, long preganglionic, right? Sympathetic, short preganglionic. You get to that synapse between the pre and the post, okay? And in the parasympathetic, at the neuroeffector junction, as it's called, okay, we're going to have the cholinergic muscarinic receptor, okay? In the sympathetic, we're going to have the norepinephrine, and we're going to have the adrenergic receptor, okay? Adrenergic receptor. So between pre and post, acetylcholine on both. Between post and effector organ, acetylcholine, muscarinic, right? Norepinephrine, adrenergic on the sans, okay? And then we have the effector organ. Oh my goodness, look at this. We have the heart in both cases here, all right? But the effect is going to be different because it's going to affect different receptors. And they might actually have an opposite effect. Yes?
So the nicotinic receptors would be on the postganglionic neurons, that basically catch that action potential, so that
And have an action.
for both parasympathetic and
Yes, but at the post-sympathetic, it's going to be different, okay?
at the effector
For
cell.
the SANS, it's going to be the adrenergic receptors. For the PANS, it's going to be the muscarinic.
And that's
okay?
the receptor.
And at the effector organ, there can be nicotinic, but that's usually going to be with our motor fibers. We'll talk about that in a second, with our voluntary skeletal muscle, okay? So just remember that it's going to be, here it's going to be acetylcholine, cholinergic, nicotinic. Here it's going to be cholinergic muscarinic, or it's going to be norepinephrine, okay, adrenergic.
Okay.
There, okay? So there we go. Acetylcholine, norepinephrine, all right? And your book shows another, again, I just put this in there again as a reminder of how it's different between the PANS versus the SANS. I won't go through it again, we just walked through this, okay? So just remember those different responses. Yeah? We're gonna get to that when we get to how it affects the tissues. Yep, there are, remember, at any given tissue, there's a whole bunch of different kinds of receptors. And different neurotransmitters and different drugs are gonna affect them differently. And whether it affects the alpha or the beta is going to affect how our body responds, okay? We'll get to that. We just want you to know at this point that different ones exist. Okay. Somatic. Okay, the somatic nervous system. What does that have to do with?
Voluntary.
Voluntary movement, okay? Soma means body. So think about body movement when you hear somatic. And because we're going to be talking about effects of drugs, even though this is not part of the ANS system, if you will, okay? We do have responses, okay, at the neuromuscular junction of skeletal tissue that controls voluntary responses. This is why the difference between the muscarinic and the nicotinic. But its receptors are nicotinic, okay? Nicotinic cholinergic. And this was what can cause you to move, to have voluntary movement. So it's not muscarinic, it's nicotinic. And when we talk about drugs that affect the different types of receptors and have different responses, I'll say to you, there's a muscarinic response, the muscarinic receptors, okay, but not nicotinic, okay? So that's something that stimulates your system to make you salivate or make your eyes water, okay, affects the muscarinic, but it doesn't affect the nicotinic, so it doesn't paralyze you. Okay? So don't worry about that now, okay? But when I say to you there's a difference between muscarinic and nicotinic, like right now you're thinking, why does that matter?
Yeah.
But when we talk about the effect of receptors in drugs, you'll see why it matters, okay? So we do want you to know that at the neuromuscular junction, okay, between the neurons and the muscles for voluntary movement, the receptors are nicotinic cholinergic, not muscarinic cholinergic, okay? All right, and there you go, there's the little stick drawing of there, okay? So we've got the neuron there, and you see this, the acetylcholine is released there at the neuromuscular junction, okay? And that's nicotinic cholinergic, and it controls voluntary movement. Okay, so now we're going to actually start talking about some drugs, okay? The drug groups of the autonomic nervous system, both the PANS and the SANS.